I'm Nancy Long, and I'm president of the Genealogy Society, Ames Genealogical Society, and welcome everybody. This is our first kickoff program for 2021, and we had to have Paul come because he would be a good one to get us started. And as we as genealogies, we've had the summer, hopefully, to be able to get out of and visit with family and friends, visit cemeteries, and make new genealogy finds to put pieces of our puzzle together. And thus, Paul will help us piece some of these together from part of the puzzle from the past and see how our ancestors arrived in the United States. Paul has achieved many accolades and much in his career, and they're too many to mention now, so I won't. We just want to get on and hear what he has to tell us. Paul Lasley.
It's nice to see everybody, and welcome to those of you that are joining us virtually. And I want to thank the Genealogical Society for inviting me once again to talk to this group. I wish all of you could be here, but under the constraints of the pandemic, social distancing and mask wearing. So if I don't recognize you, it's because half of your face is covered up. You know, as I was saying here, listening to the introductions, I thought, this is a classic case of the importance of writing your stories. Can you imagine how people are how your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will read your stories of the pandemic in 2021? The disruptions that it's caused. And one of the things that I will spend a good portion of today is really linking genealogy and social histories together. And so as you're writing your social histories, think about how your life has changed in the last 2 years. And think about all the adaptations that you've made as a result of this virus. So I'm going to spend a bit of time simply reviewing some of the key questions that every genealogist and every social historian should be addressing, and that is, and I've lost some of the equipment, I've got it now, but understanding your roots. And so I'm going to start with some preliminary questions. But just as immigration is controversial today, if you go back over history, it has been controversial since the pre-colonial period. So I'm going to spend some time talking about both push as well as pull factors that account for the immigration. I think I went. So when did they arrive? When did your ancestors arrive? Many of you have already established that or will establish that. When did they first set foot into the new country? How did they come? Did they come alone? Did they come as a family unit? Was it in a community that moved? These are all contextual variables that are important in understanding migration. Throughout Iowa and Nebraska, I've been interested in the orphan trains. Those were migrants. Those were children that were in East Coast orphanages that were sent westward on what was called the orphan train. It happens to be that I know a few people or their ancestors were part of that emptying out of the orphanages in Philadelphia. So it's important to understand where they came alone, and in some cases, maybe an adventurous young man, or sometimes a couple of brothers, generally younger, would migrate. what were their occupations in their country of origin? Now, there are some of our surnames will reflect the career. Miller's is probably the good example, but Brickman or John's son of John. So names sometimes will give you an indication of their career, their occupation. What were their new occupations? Some brought their skills with them and were able to keep their occupation. But in terms of understanding your roots, how did people make a living? Some attention needs to be paid to their faith community or their church membership. And some of you that have been working and documenting your genealogy can find church records, especially in Europe. That's terribly important. Baptismal records. Some churches have done a good job in preserving. So understanding their faith tradition may give you some clues. So I always like to throw in a quiz question. Some of you that may have heard me speak on this topic before will know the answer, but Missouri, my home state, became a state in 1821. Iowa did not achieve statehood until 1846, so there's 25 years difference. Now, why do you suppose that Missouri was 25 years ahead of Iowa? Well, with immigration, you mentioned railroads, it really was transportation. It was easier to get to Missouri than it was Iowa. And because of the importance, not only of railroads, which comes a bit later, but water transportation, riverboat transportation. And I want to spend some time talking about that, because if you can figure out where your ancestors landed, and so you know 2 points, if you can figure out where they landed first in this country, and now we've got them in Iowa, how they got here begins to help understand that social history of your family. So Missouri became a state because people could get to Missouri easier. Eastern Iowa being somewhat of an exception because they could bring riverboats from St. Louis up to Dubuque. But understanding the importance of river transportation. So this is before railroad expansion into the Midwest. And so part of it is understanding not only the migration pattern, but where those migration routes were. So the Missouri became a state as part of Congress's intention to maintain equal balance in Congress between slave states and free states. So Missouri is the furthest northern slave state, was admitted in 1821. And part of that compromise was that no slave state would be admitted unless it was partnered with a free state. So in the case of Missouri, Missouri was admitted in 1821, and it was linked with Maine as a free state. Now, the Missouri Compromise also prohibited slavery north of the, henceforth from the Missouri-Arkansas line. The reason I mention that is today we see increasing tensions of what I call north-south tensions. And if you look at various policies in Congress today, you see a skewed difference between northern states and southern states. And sometimes I say the Civil War is still continuing. It's not just on the question of, it's not slavery anymore, but voting rights even the question of mask wearing, if you look at states that have banned mask wearing, with the exception of Iowa, they're southern states. So let's talk about how your ancestors likely got here. So the first wave of migration into Iowa, the Iowa Territory, was southern Iowa. Southern Iowa was settled much earlier than central and northern Iowa. And the southern occurred, the southern route tended to be from Virginia, and I hope you can read it, across the Appalachia through the Boone Trail to the Cumberland Gap, across the Kentucky Blue Ridge area to the Ohio River, down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River. And this is from St. Louis. Then you could either go on westward on the Missouri River or continue northward as far as Dubuque. There were smaller boats that went as far north as Minneapolis. This would have been before the dams were put in, so this is very early. So when you look at the settlement of Iowa, the southern Iowa, much earlier than the northern part. So St. Louis became known as the gateway to the West, hence the arch, the St. Louis Arch represents that gateway to the West. The second route, which primarily affected central and northern Iowa, was immigrants getting to Pittsburgh and down the Ohio River. And so both of these migration streams converge in St. Louis. And it's then later, but the extension of the transcontinental railroad system that we see railroads become terribly important. So northern Iowa, the topography was such, and understanding the ecology of northern and parts of central Iowa, swamps and marshes, tall prairie grass, but the railroads played a significant and terribly important role in bringing immigrants in. Now, I don't know, obviously, we have some records of ship logs of people who came from Europe on ships. And I suspect some of you have dug into those in trying to find your ancestors. But it occurs to me that, and I don't know whether they kept receipts of who traveled on railroads in those early days. Was there a log of maintained? And I don't know the answer. Does anybody here explored? See, I know that many of our ancestors, because I've talked to people who have said, that not only were they passengers on the train, but they also brought their household stuff. And so they shipped their farm equipment or their personal belongings as well as passengers. Yes, we have a question.
Ancestor, and I have a receipt of his that were on the boat, but he also had a train.
So you. Okay, so this lady says that she has a record of the passenger list from the ship coming across the Atlantic, and your family's in possession of documents from the railroad of moving westward. That's been valuable in understanding how they got here. And unfortunately, some of us were so poor that we probably didn't have.
It was arranged
Oh, so the ship and the railroad transportation was linked together. Yeah, okay, so that verifies what I thought there might be some evidence of that. Thank you. So by 1860, so Iowa became a state in 46, and Iowa was a frontier. So if your ancestors came before statehood, chances are they settled in southeast Iowa or southern Iowa, because this was a frontier. So 1860, draw a line from St. Paul to Fort Worth. That was the line of the frontier. And of course, the frontier keeps moving west. I want to ask you about that, or we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is not a very good illustration, but it sort of shows how the frontier moved. So what I've done, and I don't know why we have that. That's okay. I know you guys are working hard. What I did was I drew lines. So the heavy line, so the first heavy line, and I think there's a pointer on this, but I don't know how to use it. Is that it? Ah. So this line is 1800. This is the frontier in 1800 was really along the Atlantic coast. By 1820, where did my little thing go? There it is. 1820, the line comes. So now by 1820, you see it slaps across Illinois, picks up much of eastern Missouri, and on down through to New Orleans. The next line, which the label is missing on, is 1840. So I did this in 20-year increments. By 1840, and this is the section I want to focus on, 1840, much of the settlement in Iowa, the frontier, was eastern side of Iowa. And you see Missouri, by 1840, much of Missouri is settled. Statehood granted in 1821. And then the next line is 1860. It's the next heavy line. And by 1860, you see the frontier moved from eastern Iowa to eastern Nebraska. So by 1860, most of the land in Iowa had been occupied. And what's interesting, as a sort of a side note, is that people that came from Europe, many of our ancestors, kept moving westward. And as they moved westward, the frontier kept pushing further west. And some of that, certainly from 1850s and 60s, and especially after the Civil War, we continued with railroad expansion. So if you sort of understand how the earliest ancestors in Iowa were, many of them came up. So here's the Mississippi River, the Missouri River would kind of essentially traverses the state. For those of you that are from southern Iowa or northern Missouri, there's a very interesting piece of history about why there's this little jog in which is where Keokuk is, Lee County. That was called the Honey Wars. I happen to be from that part of from that region. You don't hear much about the Honey Wars, but in fact, and it had to do, the Honey War was a dispute over the boundary between Missouri and Iowa. And it has to do with the land measurement that Iowa, Missouri, who became state, said the state line was to the furthest most rapid on the Des Moines River. The state of Iowa said, no, it's not the Northern Rapids. There are 3 rapids at the time on the Des Moines River. It's a further south. And so they actually, there was a little skirmish. There was a, they call it the Honey War. You can read about the history in Iowa, but that results in this little jog because the compromise was, well, we'll take the middle boundary. And so if you're from that part of the state, understanding, so hopefully you'll be able to get a copy of this PowerPoint. But much of what the attraction to move westward during this period of time was access to land. Access to land. Western Europe was a caste system, which was a feudal system in which land belonged to the king and the noble class. And most people that were farmers did not own the land. They rented the land. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But you have to understand land policies in order to understand the Western migration. It was the access to land. So it attracted immigrants. Some people have called land the magnet. First used in the colonies, but it became a way to attract people, the opportunity to own land that had been denied our ancestors in Europe. It also raised money. We could sell land and use that as the proceeds from the sale of land to build the infrastructure that was needed, roads, bridges, schools. We can talk a lot about the role of land. It also, land was used as script for serving in the military. If you served in the military, instead of cash, sometimes you could get a script or a title to land. Much of our education system in America was built on land. One section in each township was reserved for the support of public education. Dates back to the mid-1800s. Iowa State University and other land grant universities are called land grant universities because we took unsold land, and each state was given 50,000 acres that could be sold to build colleges of agriculture. Now, Iowa State University was established, I believe, in 1859. By 1859, most of the land in Iowa had already been settled, except for that far northwest corner that I showed you. If you look, when you review the slides, you'll see it's the northwest corner that was unsettled. And most of the land that was used to finance the first buildings on Iowa State University, that land was in northwest Iowa. And so we have some local history about land policy and creating land grant universities, as well as your ancestors. Many of them attended country schools. Those country schools were public lands that had been sold to finance building of schools. A lot of people said, well, food production. Well, food production is only one of many. It encouraged investments and savings. See, we had a policy that we were bringing in all these poor people by the hundreds of thousands if they would make investments in land and homes and buildings. That was an investment. And we encouraged investment in land. And the early political philosophy was, if people owned land, they would be motivated to participate in self-governing democracy. And so that was a huge debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because the model in Europe was only the royalty would own land. And if you think about how different America's trajectory was, if we would have accepted the European model of essentially a feudalism, would people have come? Likely not. How would our rural culture be different if vast tracts of land were owned by a small few? We would call it corporate agriculture today, I suppose. But that debate, Alexander Hamilton said, just dispose the land in large tracts of well-to-do individuals. Thomas Jefferson was the one who argued that we needed to create a nation of small landholders. Well, we need to move on. It was effective. So this is simply a rural urban to give you a sense of how things have changed. This is in 1790. Almost 100% of Americans were farmers or lived in rural America. And that was partly because we had liberal land policies. In fact, the most liberal land disposal policy was the Homestead Act of 1862. And some of you that are with us today, if you own land, you can look back through the abstract of your farms and will find that in fact it was either through the Homestead Act of 1862 or was acquired through the railroads that received alternating sections of land that they could sell to finance the construction of railroads. So it depends on when your ancestors came, but you see this, we were a rural nation. Now there were some blitz. About 1865 is when we began to see some shift as a proportion of rural declined and the proportion of urban America increased. And I always try to point out that it's really in the 1920s and 1930s that there was an equal balance between rural and urban people in this country. And that decline, unfortunately, of rural, the proportion of rural has continued to decline. And so you can see the widening gap. And I've spent quite a bit of my career talking about the implications of this rural-urban divide, not only in Iowa, but nationally and internationally. But the role of land attracted many of our ancestors. This shows a historical record, the best I can find, of immigration. So this is legal immigration in the United States. When I say immigration has been controversial, you can see how it's fluctuated over time. Large bounces. There was a huge bounce at the turn of the last century in the 1900 period. Some of us have roots back in this period. The Great Depression, certainly with the Great Depression, and then we've seen a spike here in 1989, and we're sort of bouncing around, but actually immigration today is less than it was in 1989. I think much of the controversy around immigration is that these are not, many of the recent immigrants are not Europeans. They're from the Americas, they're Latinx, Mexican, South Americans, but understanding why did we allow so many immigrants to come in this country? You know, our ancestors came here. And there's really sort of two factors. One was industrial America needed workers. And so the northern states, particularly the New England states, argued for liberal immigration policy. They needed workers, and there was not enough domestic workers. And so to keep the immigration doors open to fuel industrial America. And that becomes even more important with the tragedy of the Civil War. In order to fuel the Union forces, we needed munition plants, and we needed soldiers, and we needed immigrants. And so part of the war, Civil War, which, by the way, it's not called the Civil War in the South. It's what? The Northern aggression. And it shows that regional split between an agrarian South and an industrializing Northern. So the topic that I think merits more attention that from genealogists and social historians is, how did your ancestors get here? Some were poor. Most of them needed a sponsor. Many of them had some connection. We oftentimes use the word indentured servant, but people had to pay, had to work, or they needed a sponsor to get from Europe to this country. And I would encourage you to look and see if you can identify your early ancestors and if they had a sponsor. Most of our ancestors were poor, and under the feudal system of Western Europe, where land belonged to the king or the royalty or friends and families of our allies of the ruling class. So those of us with long ties to farming will discover that our ancestors were tenant farmers who paid rent to the owners, and oftentimes they led pretty miserable lives. By and large, most of us are descendants of peasantry. And we can look, those of you that probably the best illustrated example is the Irish. The Irish immigrants was triggered by the potato famine in 1848, I think it was. But people were fleeing poverty. There was an opportunity. There were opportunities in the New World, but there was a lot of push factors, and poverty. In short, life was short, miserable, and often brutal. Life in poverty provided the impetus for those to leave. That was a push factor. New opportunities for self-improvement and to leave a life of impoverishment, exploitation, and discrimination. You know, many of us in our 8th grade history were told of the Pilgrims and the Puritans fled to this country because of religious persecution. And that's true, but that's only really part of the story. People were leaving because they had, not only was the land tied up by the feudal system, but there also was, feudalism rested on something called primogeniture, the exclusive rights of inheritance of the firstborn son. So if you were the 2nd, 3rd, or 8th son, what was your chance of ever breaking into the land ownership? So you became a worker for somebody else. They left because they fled poverty, discrimination, exploitation. Now, the reason I emphasize that, why are so many Latinos trying to get into this country? For the very same reason that motivated our ancestors, to avoid exploitation and poverty and for the opportunities. So oftentimes when I talk to groups, I try to get them to understand that the motivations for for migration is no different today than it was for our ancestors. We were fortunate enough, those of us who came in past centuries, there was a welcoming world for us, maybe more welcoming than today. So let me talk a bit about stories. Stories that not only should you be searching out stories of your ancestors, but you should be recording your stories. Because it's really that provides the context and understanding not only patterns of migration and settlement, but it tells us about their livelihood and their values and their aspirations. It's a context. So it's more than simply understanding your lineage. The stories really provide an understanding of our roots. The feudal system was based, there's the word primogeniture that I wanted to call to your attention. Exclusive rights of inheritance of the firstborn son. We still see evidence of community migration across Iowa. We have very strong German Catholic or German Lutherans or Dutch Reform. It's not as visible today as it was maybe 100 years ago, but some of that reflects migration patterns that a family would get established and they would write a letter home to a cousin or to a brother or a sister and encourage, so you end up with these ethnic communities. Now, given the mobility, some of that ethnicity has gotten watered down. So I can use examples from my family. My grandmother was raised in a community. It's not a town. There was never a store there. There's a Lutheran church, but it was called Germania. And everybody spoke German. And my grandmother, as a child, all the services were in German. Until World War II. And they were ashamed. They were embarrassed as reports came out. And so they tried to disassociate themselves. So they started using English in their services. But it was because of the atrocities of the war. But she would tell about as a small child that her ancestors spoke German and were very proud to be a German. And I suspect that you have some of those same sorts of stories. Some other things that are terribly important are, and I hope that as you not only study your lineage, but you collect these letters and diaries and journals, sale bills, passenger lists, family Bibles, museums, obituaries are all important things that provide some insights about your family. Now, I want to caution you, pushed the wrong button, the importance of triangulation. Triangulation is simply to get multiple sources. Triangulation is a word that we oftentimes use in sociology. Don't just focus on one source, but if you can get 2 or 3 sources that lead you to the same conclusion. So Lynette has dug into my family history, and that's why I call her a myth buster, because there were lots of myths in my family that she has destroyed. I was told that my grandmother, 3 generations removed, was a Fox Indian because they came from Southeast Iowa, and very likely because there were Fox Indians down there. So I did the genetic test. Guess how much Indian blood I have in me? 0. Annette was talking with one of my cousins recently that said that one of my great grandfathers was that the cousin was married to Pocahontas, something like that. Lynette came back and went into her machine. Not possible unless Pocahontas lived to be 116 years old, because the time. But see, so if you rely on a simple family story, it may or may not be true. But if you can verify, so triangulation is about verification. And so things may help. The letters, diaries, journals, the more information you can get. So it's not just about pedigree, but it's about understanding those. Let's see. So I've already mentioned, but computerization and genetic testing has all made it genealogy more possible. It's opened up new opportunities. But what it doesn't do is provide the traditions from the old world that remain with us, that inform who we are. So my part of my concluding thought is you cannot separate genealogy from social history. Wars, strifes, pandemics like we're in today, climate change, poverty, hardship, all play a role in migration. So I think we have a handout. Mary, did we make handouts? Okay, that I think provides some good context. So members have a handout. At the bottom of that handout gives major sort of global changes that occurred. So linking one's genealogy to global events. What was going on? Was it war? Was it disease? In understanding who we are. And I want to encourage you not only to look for these stories, but equally important is to write your stories. As somebody reads through your life history, the story of the pandemic, or the derecho, or the conditions that existed in 9/11. What were you doing? What happened when America was attacked in 2001? So with that, I'm going to stop, and hopefully we can have a robust discussion on topics or issues that you would like. So I guess folks online can use chat, and you in the audience can use a microphone so that our virtual participants can hear the question. Is that so? Who's got a comment or question? And since they took my computer away, I can't even see the chat. So, but you'll read the questions as they come in on chat. Okay, all right, excellent. Questions, comments, thoughts, ideas. What should I have elaborated more on? It's open game. That's deafening silence. Mary's going to bail me out. Mary's going to get me started. Okay.
How many of the settlers in about the 1850 to say 1890, how many of them went back to their country of origin willingly?
Migration? Oh, now that's an interesting question, one that I really haven't looked at very closely. There certainly are some, but most of the return migration that I'm aware of was settlers that moved out west for free land and they couldn't make a living there, and they migrated back so in the early part of the 20th century, as the frontier moved westward, we were giving 640 acres, or generally was 640 acres or a parcel of a 640 to settlers. The Homestead Act, and while And when they got out on the prairie, they discovered 640 acres was simply not enough land. And so in the 1920s, we've seen a large number of people that moved to South Dakota, North Dakota, eastern Montana. In fact, I think it was the governor of South Dakota that called out the National Guard to feed settlers. And so they moved, many of them came back to Iowa or Minnesota, Wisconsin, where they had originated from. Returning back to Europe, I don't think very many, if any. But thank you, Mary, for that question. We have another question.
Was the Missouri River used for transportation to get to western Iowa and up into the Dakotas? And a second question, we always talk about movement from eastern United States to west. Was there anything from like the Asia side coming to the California area and moving eastward?
Okay, so let's take the Missouri River question. The Missouri River was a major corridor, not only for passengers, but freight. But the Missouri River has often been described as a mile wide and an inch deep. And so there were hundreds of ships that sunk. They would hit a log or a sandbar. And so there's a couple of museums in Kansas City area where they've excavated steamships. What's fascinating to me, I forget the name of the museum. I want to say Emporium. Anyway, if you go on steamboat museums in Kansas City, where these were huge ships with houses and entire homes that could be constructed and passengers. But what I find interesting is some of those have been excavated or 5 to 7 miles away from the current river. So they're out in people's cornfields. So that shows how the river has shifted. But there was a major corridor, and I'm not exactly sure how far north they went. Certainly beyond Sioux City and into the Dakotas with smaller vessels. And what I'm not sure about is whether they have logged passengers on those steamboats. But now you ask about the Western migration, because we did have significant numbers of Asians that came into California in particular, especially during the building of railroads, a lot of Chinese workers. But they weren't farmers. And of course, they were brought here for industrial workers, and they found a very hostile environment. And if you read the history of how we treated many of those workers, we used them and sent them home. And that actually continued through World War II with the internment camps of Japanese Americans. So we've not really seen, now, in the last 20 years, and in the last 10 years in particular, demographers have been watching the Western migration out of the Western states. And it is substantial, but it's not because of our lack of opportunities, it's because of the high cost of living, congestion and traffic. Now we're seeing concerns about fires many people are moving from California and they are moving eastward. Whether that will persist or not, I'm not sure. This summer with heat waves in Portland in excess of 100 degrees, and most of those people have never seen that kind of temperature. That may cause more people to move eastward. I hear about people moving out of California to Idaho, Montana, Arizona, Nevada. I think it's probably temporary, but that's an interesting observation. Thank you. Other questions?
Iowa came in with Texas, is that correct?
With Maine.
No, Iowa.
Oh, that's right, in 46, that's right, I'm sorry, yes.
Okay. And how about New Orleans passengers? I know most of my ancestors came to New York on the boat, but there's a few that came through New Orleans.
Right, and the port of New Orleans was important, but it all was rich, so they came with steamboats, and that was the mode of transportation up through New Orleans. It's not as well documented because it's quite a bit further. You know, if you're for Europeans, they come into New York as opposed to going clear around the Florida and up the coast, up the Gulf to New Orleans. But the port of New Orleans is important, and that was river transportation. I'm not sure that much of that migration reached Iowa, but there would be some that would continue then on a smaller vessel, a boat, on up the Mississippi River. So I can't, but you should explore that. You know, especially if you've got ancestors that, you know, Indiana is an interesting state because we actually used it. Recall the Canadians were, before we owned Louisiana, Canada expelled French Canadians to New Orleans or the Cajun country. And that again was a forced relocation, not of our doings, but we ended up with the Cajun culture because of Canada policy on exporting French Canadians. The story of Arcadia comes to mind. Yeah. Interesting. I can't tell you much about migration from New Orleans. I'm guessing it's more of a Southern, but I don't know that for sure. Other questions? Do we have anything on from our listeners at home? Yeah, I'm kind of disadvantaged. I'm sort of one-handed right now. They took my computer. Who knows where it's at? Maybe it left forever.
Nora asks, what is a good resource to find what port our ancestors left from and where they arrived in America?
Well, you really should talk to a genealogist and not a sociologist. But if you know your ethnicity and you can go to the country of origin, most of those ports you can find the major port cities. But so if you know you're of German extraction, the problem with like Germany was there were people who came directly from Germany as well as those who migrated to like the Netherlands and then migrated over. But if you can come, you know, that's less of a problem for Irish. The most Irish left from Cork, but there were ships that left from Dublin. So it depends on your ethnicity. But if you can get back to the passenger logs, and some people will be able to. Now, in my case, my own personal genealogy. We find ancestors, but we know they're from Germany. So it's a sort of at this point, a dead end. But then there are other families that have been able to, to travel to Europe and seeing their ancestral homes or farms, and I'm somewhat envious. I may just have to go to Europe and just say all of this. So can't really help you, Nora, but thank you for the question. Yeah, so okay, you can so thank you that you can track, if you know what year, you can look them up So we're back now to the 1840 census. Is that correct? That's the last available census is available? No, no, you can go back. 1870 is available. Can't you get to the 1840? So you have to get to the immigration records.
The census tells you what year they immigrated, but it starts like in 1900.
Oh,
1800 census will tell you.
so the 1900 census will give the year that they immigrate. Does it,
Go to shipwreck.
and then you go to the ship records based on that from 1900. Okay, Nora, I hope you caught that. Recommendation from one of our fellow participants is go to the 1900 census, which has year that the family immigrated. And if you can get to the year they immigrated, then you go to the passenger list, and that might be able to get you back to your country of origin. Thank you for the question.
Okay, and Patricia comments, just for fun, Paul, the year railroads came to Waverly was the same year that an ordinance was passed requiring people not to allow their pigs to run loose anymore. Museum here was built as a stagecoach shop in 1862.
Yeah, in 1862. And that's in Waverly.
Mhm.
Yeah, railroad towns become very important. Unfortunately, we didn't document much of the history, but Tricia, thank you for that. I was not aware of that.
That's all of our questions so far.
Any other questions or comments? I don't want to take more than my time, although we did get started late, technical glitches, but this unfortunately is probably the new normal. Doing virtual meetings, and so we just have to expect technical glitches till we all become experts at this. Well, it is 11:15. I know you've got a workshop starting here shortly, right? A help session. Well, once again, thank you so much. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and good luck in documenting your family lineage and stories. So thank you very much. Thank you to those of you that joined us online today.